Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On June 2nd, David and I recorded a live webinar with Dr. Rose Mutiso, Research Director at the Energy for Growth Hub. We talked about energy production and consumption in sub-Saharan Africa. The first time we've done so in a meaningful way on EVC, though I expect not the last. Rose, David, and I covered a range of topics with a particular focus on electricity and power grids, one of Rose's areas of expertise. I really enjoyed the conversation and found it both encouraging but also difficult, given the vast economic inequity that still exists between the global north and south. Now here's the show. Hello everyone and welcome to Season 6, Episode 13 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham and I'm joined by my co-host David Keith. Today we have a very special guest to chat with David and me about the tension between energy, climate, and economic development with a particular focus in Africa and more broadly the global south. And we're going to talk about Africa's energy transition. We're going to talk about equity and justice and ways to mitigate the compounding effects of climate change and ongoing economic marginalization and inequity. And now to our special guest. So Dr. Rose Mutiso is the Research Director for the Energy for Growth Hub, and her research interests are particularly focused on energy transition and emerging energy technologies in Africa, in the African context. Previously, Rose was a senior officer in the Office of International Climate and Clean Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, where she led the DOE's engagement on tech and policy dimensions of energy access in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. She also co-founded and previously served as CEO of the Mawazo Institute, which is a nonprofit research institute based in Nairobi that supports the next generation of female scholars and thought leaders in Africa. She's also in the process of forming a new institute, which we'll talk about. And lastly, she's the co-host of a great podcast that I've just started listening to, Rose, called High Energy Planet. And we're really grateful to have her join us today. So welcome, Rose.
Thanks for having me, Ed. And thanks for listening to our podcast.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Well, this is one of the wonderful things about Energy versus Climate, where we have guests on. Often guests have podcasts, and I get to listen to new podcasts as a result. But before we get in, David, anything that you want to add off the top?
Not particularly. I had a wonderful conversation with Rose in South Africa a couple of weeks ago on climate engineering topics, and I'm really fascinated to focus this on really understanding more about energy in Africa.
So let's start, Rose. You've got a Substack as well. It's called Kibao, and I assume that's Swahili, but what does that word mean, and how does that relate to your work?
Really, really good question. Actually, nobody has asked me this before. I mean, I haven't had a Substack for that long, so I guess it's still pretty fresh. So please, listeners, subscribe. It's a lot of fun. I try to kind of make you think and also kind of do take interesting takes and kind of expand the aperture for how people think about different issues in African energy, climate, and tech. So Kibao has dual meaning. So in pure Kiswahili, it literally is like a board, so like a notice board. It's a kibao. It's like a piece of wood, almost like a plank of wood would be a kibao. But also in this sense, I mean in terms of a board, like a notice board. If you put a notice on a kibao. Kibao in slang. So I grew up in Nairobi in the 80s and 90s, and we pretty much originated a slang, which is kind of English and Kiswahili mixed up, plus other stuff thrown in. And Kibao, when in the 90s, was like a lot. So if you're like a rapper, you'd be like, I have fans Kibao, like I have a lot of fans. And so I put these two meanings together because I think of the Substack as where I post my thoughts. And then I have a lot of thoughts on many different topics. And so, it's kind of working on those two parallel meanings, both the pure Kiswahili meaning and the slang meaning.
I love that. And people can go to your Substack and get that content and learn a lot more about what you're thinking and more about the African context and all the work that you do. So, and hopefully you get that question more often now. You've spoken about growing up in Nairobi in the 1990s. And doing that, you experienced power rationing, you experienced the concept that not everyone is always familiar with, energy poverty. We'll talk about that. And I experienced the same. I was in Guinea and Sierra Leone in 2000 for not that long, but I recall, when the power would go out and unexpectedly or at, timed intervals, and all the workarounds, and some of these Sierra Leonean kids would be out and studying by candlelight, trying to keep up on their work, or they would find some light that's running and crowd around that. But going back to your experience growing up in the 90s in Nairobi, how did that personal experience shape your understanding of energy poverty? And yeah, if you could just maybe define, I think most people are familiar with it, but define energy poverty as well.
So energy poverty is, basically many people in the world live without either fully lacking access to modern energy or suffer with very unreliable energy. The energy poverty problem actually has two main dimensions. One is an electricity problem, and the other is actually like a cooking fuels problem. And I focus more on the electricity problem in terms of the kind of power sector and the blackouts, the shortages, the unreliable power, the expensive power, the lack of power. But I just want to bookmark for the listener that there's another really big and important part of the problem, which is many people in the world cook with traditional fuels, charcoal, and it has huge implications for health. And that's a big part of the challenge. But I'll just bookmark that because that's like not really the focus of my work. So electricity access is, basically globally, like almost several 100 million people live without access to electricity. That means you don't have lighting at home. You just use kerosene lamps or, candles. So this is people literally living like a century behind the rest of the world. So that's kind of the most kind of viscerally visible part of the problem. There's another problem, which is what, Ed, you were describing, which is, when you expand the problem to you're living with expensive, unreliable power, then we go up to billions of people in the world are kind of experiencing really like erratic power, blackouts, rationing. In rich countries, you just have 24/7 power. And sometimes you do have incidents where there are big events where there are blackouts, but for the most part, you can kind of expect to have power. So, this is a big problem. When I was growing up in Nairobi, this was just the way of life. We had chronic power shortages. We relied on some old hydro dams, and we were constantly, which are very vulnerable to droughts. Where in Kenya, we are kind of, it's a semi-arid country. A lot of parts of it, we don't get, that much rain, as opposed to, say, in more central parts of Africa. Anytime we had a dry season or a drought, just immediately no power. So really extreme rationing regimes. Power is really expensive. Like my mom would be honest, like if a light bulb is on for like half a millisecond longer than it should be, because we really felt the cost of power. And one thing that's really interesting in just my coming of age is that the picture changed drastically. So when I was really young, it was just a fact of life that there'll be frequent shortages and rationing. But around the 2000s, Kenya brought online, or the late 90s, early 2000s, brought online geothermal powers. Kenya started building power plants off of geothermal steam. And that made a huge difference. I remember as I was, in my late teens, we like the situation was less extreme. And that's just because we like diversified our power sector and we're not just relying on hydro. So I've kind of seen a bit of an arc, a bit of progress.
It's changing everywhere. It's good to know about that progress. I've spoken recently, and I pulled up some stats talking about electricity. And here in Canada, if I leave a 40-watt light bulb in my house for an hour, the cost to me is less than half of 1 cent Canadian. And that's extraordinarily cheap. And in fact, electricity was 200 times more affordable in the year 2000 when I was in Sierra Leone and Guinea than it was in 1990. And Canada as a country spends 2 to 3% of its GDP on electricity, which is also, a fraction of other countries.
I think that poor people pay more for their power. So the poorer you are, the more expensive your power by far.
Exactly. So the stat is 160 million people in the world don't have reliable access to electricity. And for that, many have to walk to stores and say pay 25 cents or more to charge a cell phone. And that's hundreds of times more than what we pay in Canada. And actually, when I run the numbers, it's 192 times more than what we pay if you're taking like an all-inclusive cost of 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
If you look beyond individuals and what we're paying in our homes, if you're a company, this is a huge cost center. So you're so price sensitive. And so, this is part of the work of the Energy for Growth Hub where I've been working is shining a light to that kind of the non-residential part of the picture and just the impact on the economy to have such endemically costly power, it really puts the brakes on your economy.
David, you shared with us an Economist article that talked about Nigeria's electricity grid, and I think that's a great case study for this discussion. Could you talk about that article?
Yeah, I found it fascinating. I've never actually traveled to Nigeria myself, but I have lots of colleagues who've grown up there, lived there, and it's obviously this monster country, over 200 million people, about mid 15% of all the people in sub-Saharan Africa, and in many ways, lots of business and other enterprise, and yet its electricity system seems like kind of stuck in a terrible middle ground where many, it sounds like, wealthy people and businesses are basically assuming it doesn't work, and so all are having backup power. And for a variety of reasons, there's really not investment in the grid infrastructure. And so even in large cities, even with a fair amount of generation, the grid goes down very frequently. And I guess, I know, Rose, that you don't work especially there, but it seems like a case study because Nigeria is the, outside, I guess, South Africa, kind of biggest country, and a country that we all hope can be much more successful. And electricity is a key to that. Tell us a little bit about why it's bad, but also, how you could imagine it getting better.
Yeah, and I mean, Nigeria is a complicated country. Like each African country has its own kind of set of complications and constraints. Before I get into all of the kind of woebegone, everything is not working properly, I just want to say something about Nigeria, which is a super vibrant place. And if you haven't already, check out Afrobeats, which is a Nigerian export to the world, and is all of pop music in the world now is dominated by Nigerians. So it's a very creative, very vibrant space. That being said, I think a place like Nigeria is just compounding of so much dysfunction. You have a lot of, governance, political challenges, a post-independence elite who have, underinvested in public goods. You have the problem of the kind of, a very difficult and corrupt extractive industry. So Nigeria is a huge oil producer, so it's a big fossil fuel producer, a big energy producer, but has not invested for many dysfunctional reasons in their domestic consumption and growth. And I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the drivers of the dysfunction. But maybe what I'd like to pick out, because we don't have enough time to talk about all of that. Maybe what I'd like to pick out is what you said about when you don't create public goods and shared infrastructure for all of these different reasons, then everybody loses. And so the elites and the rich people have diesel generators. So I have a colleague who does work on this, and I don't have the number right off the bat, but the installed generation in generator terms in Nigeria is huge. And this is really expensive power. But if you can't, it's just, and you can't rely on the grid. And so you basically generate your own power. And so I have a colleague who says, it's interesting that we are talking about distributed energy systems and how we kind of go to a more distributed energy system and power system in the future. A country like Nigeria is all distributed energy. It's just a very kind of dysfunctional type because it's generators. And so when you create this downward spiral where everybody is, essentially migrating away from the grid, and then you don't have a shared infrastructure. And then you just have inequality. People who are on the generators are paying a lot of money for their electricity. People who can afford them are living in endemic poverty, and the economy grows. And I think I'd like to contrast this with Kenya, where we have dysfunction, but there's actually a bit more shared infrastructure. So the penetration of generators is much less in a country like Kenya. So our grid is semi-functional, and everybody, all of the companies are hooked to the grid because it's cheaper and it might not always be reliable. You might have backup, but just on the spectrum of dysfunction, it's a little bit less extreme. And so I think that what happens is the dysfunction fuels this compounding risk where everybody is moving away from shared infrastructure, and that just leaves you stuck. And there's a real stuckness. One of the ways I got into this debate about, and I cover this in my tech talks about, there was a lot of interest in Africa leapfrogging legacy energy systems, and we could just have distributed solar everywhere. And that's the future, and you don't have to make the mistakes. I think I had to enter this debate from the perspective of shared infrastructure, centralized infrastructure. These are the benefits. A strong central grid that connects everybody is a great place to start. And what we see in Africa is what happens when you start without the shared infrastructure and try to work backwards. And whether that's solar or diesel generators, like we cannot emphasize the importance of shared infrastructure that kind of shares costs across the system.
I strongly agree, but I also wonder if it's changed a little bit. So sometime, I guess probably around 2015 or a little bit before, me and Ken Caldera and some others were running these educational meetings for Bill Gates, and we had Dan Kammen in, who's famous for working on a bunch of electricity.
Dan is a good friend.
Dan. Yeah, Dan was very excited about local, very small scale solar, and obviously there's a way in which, at a very small scale, if you're talking an individual household that's running kerosene lamps, kerosene's both very expensive, and when you knock the lamp over, it's a big fire hazard. It actually kills a fair number of people. So it's certainly true that it can be worthwhile for people to buy really household level solar infrastructure to allow them to have tiny lighting or recharge electric devices, even if the cost of that power is very high. But what, Bill Gates argued back to Dan, and I think I was more on Bill's side in that argument, was that thinking that this is kind of a solution is nuts, and it's sort of lowballing what we should hope for in development, and that it really was much more important for Africa to drive forward to actually build up systematic large grids. And back then, that really seemed to be right to me. I think it still seems to be right to me, and you just said that. But it does feel a little bit different now, given how cheap solar is and getting batteries cheaper. It seems less crazy to think about a kind of microgrid-based systems. So I'd really like you to hear whether your opinion has changed with solar getting so cheap.
Yeah, and it actually almost hasn't changed. I think this was kind of part of the nuance of the message, is we're solving multiple problems on multiple scales. I started my career in the space working on off-grid energy, and I've seen the difference it makes for people to go from kerosene and the advances in both kind of the costs going down with solar and the advances in LED lighting. And when you have like a super efficient end use, whether it's a TV or light or something that uses very little energy, and you pair that with a small solar panel, then people can unlock a lot of energy service. And that's great. It's still costly. It's cheaper than in some cases than dragging the grid, especially in very remote areas, but it's a way for people to have entry-level access and build some productive uses in these kind of specific cases. And actually that sector has driven a lot of access. So in Kenya, I think we're like now have almost doubled our access rate over the past decade. And a significant chunk of that has been just people coming online through these small off-grid pieces. So that's true. What the other side of the problem that you're saying, it seems more feasible that we could have a pretty distributed system and don't do the centralized grids. So, like a household solar panel system is a few kilowatt hours, a few kilowatt rating in like a place like the US. That already is pretty large scale. And then say like the really micro systems we see in very rural parts of Africa, right? So I think that already there are economies of scale, even if you're putting solar in your home, on your rooftop in a very distributed way, that size of that system is quite large compared to what you would, it's not dissimilar to what you would put on a like small commercial building or mall in Africa. So I like to push the conversation towards like there's the distributedness of it and people self-generating, and there's a scale of the installations and how you just kind of bring down costs by having larger and larger, which is like people are having bigger systems, are consuming more power. And then that there are all of the ways in which the network has to interconnect to share the benefits. So basically having central infrastructure to move electrons around to where they're produced versus where they're needed needs to coexist with the distributedness and the modularity of the generation itself. So I think it's like a very like multi-dimensional problem. So we're not saying that we just need to make traditional like large power plant, going to a consumption center, but even in these modularized, decentralized systems, you benefit from scale. So we just need to be thinking more ambitiously, and then they need to interconnect and speak to each other. And this is a problem that everybody's trying to figure out.
Yeah, so I want to push a little further. I think it really is interesting. Again, the cost of solar has changed so much, and the cost of utility scale battery or small utility scale battery storage is changing. So I'm not asking you to kind of tell us how to fix. I mean, it'd be great if you can tell us how to fix Nigeria or how Nigerians to fix themselves. It's not our job. But But you wonder if there's some intermediate scale, so much bigger than rooftop solar, but still much smaller than national grids, where some combination of local communities of significant scale nowadays, it could actually make sense to build a grid that was solar plus batteries, but not on rooftop, utility solar, with the fact that we have three big things that happened. Batteries suddenly getting to be not a joke in terms of price, solar getting really cheap, and a bunch of electric switching infrastructure that's made it easier to have robust microgrids that can interconnect when they do, but don't have to. And I wonder if that's a way to kind of actually fulfill that kind of old Van Kammen dream that I was skeptical of, maybe actually makes more sense, but not at the house scale, at a bigger scale.
I get everything you're saying, but I just my sense is that even in this scenario describing, like having aggregator institutions, business models, infrastructure that kind of interconnect all of this different kind of more sophisticated and futuristic and new tech loads and supply is still important. Like I feel like the connective tissue is still there, and I think sometimes people imagine we will kind of not need that interconnection in some way to kind of to kind of drive if both scale and efficiency across the board. And so I even with like reductions in batteries, which we're not yet there. So we still need like a lot of our renewables still, it's much cheaper to balance it out with, say, natural gas, for example. We're not yet there. But, I think that the ways that we're trying to deploy batteries, actually the first use case is actually just like to provide ancillary services to the grid. That's where the kind of the business model is. And we're kind of marching on to, as the costs come down, to pairing solar and batteries in ways that kind of move us to that vision. But I'm skeptical of not needing institutions, infrastructure, some way for us to kind of efficiently interconnect and speak and have these systems and loads speak to each other, both for an efficiency and for a cost perspective.
Last comment on this. I think this is really interesting. So just to be clear, I absolutely agree that what I hope for in the long run is that Africa has big interconnected grids. I mean, when the U.S. National Academy summarized the most important inventions of the 20th century, interconnected grids were number one, more important than computers or aircraft. I think it's a fair judgment. They're the great invention of the last century. I absolutely agree with you. That's where Africa should hope to go. But it might still be politically that you can kind of, I wonder if you can build towards a large grid from the bottom up. Maybe it's hopeless. I always used to critique this view. I'm taking the opposite side as I used to.
Yeah, it actually, so my colleagues and I literally just published a piece about the organic rise of solar, grid-connected solar in Africa. So actually, what you're describing is kind of happening where without any subsidy, without any regulation, people are putting crazy amounts of for Africa, pretty decent scale rooftop solar. So these are companies, malls, businesses, commercial buildings, whatever industry. Like people are like expanding solar at really rapid rates. And we're seeing this in other countries. People are reporting about like a solar revolution in Pakistan, whatever. And this is because of like the prices are going down. People are fed up with expensive and unreliable grid power. And so it either gives you energy security or it is, especially if you run, say, a mall or an office building, the profile of the generation matches with your load profile. And so actually there's this revolution we're seeing where people are doing aspects of what you're describing, which they are democratizing energy and they're putting their own energy. But then, I think there are some side effects to that, which is, then you're driving a lot of inequality because these users are cross-subsidized across the grid. And I think that if you undermine the grid and the health of the utilities and the centralized grid too much, I think this becomes a problem because they still value in having these institutions that, interconnect users and share kind of resources. Another thing we're seeing is that because in Africa, like if we're talking about the kind of renewable like build out that we need as part of this energy transition, the resource like is, there are parts of Africa that have like really high wind resource, really high quality, parts that have really high, like the quality of wind resource has some geographic distribution. And so you want to be able to create infrastructure that can really move these like huge resource generation points to people, to kind of make the whole system work and interconnect that with batteries and whatever. So I do think that, I think we agree. We agree. It's just that there's so much nuance and it doesn't really come through in a soundbite. So to sum up, I'm excited about like off-grid energy and how it can lift people out of extreme energy poverty and what is possible. Like there's a future in that we cannot even see now in that world as costs come down and use cases like really expand. I'm excited about the democratization of energy and people kind of building these distributed systems enabled by price going down. But I'm always so worried. I'm worried about people losing sight of shared resources and public goods.
Rose, a consistent theme in your work has been that Africa's energy transition must be driven by Africans. I do want to pivot a bit to then what does it mean for policy, technology, and the role of the global North as well. But first, just on this note of democratizing energy, and you said, well, not undermining energy infrastructure. I think of a conversation that I had with Shell's country chair for Nigeria back in mid-2016. His name was Osagie Okunbor. And it was fascinating because President Buhari had just recently come in. He'd campaigned on security, economy, economic development. We talked a lot about security and local benefits. And here it was Shell, you mentioned, Nigeria is a big oil and gas producer. Shell was then at least the largest of the companies producing there. And we figured out that oil theft in Nigeria at that time was costing 130,000 barrels per day of people going in and tapping oil and gas infrastructure and pipelines. And it created all sorts of disasters in terms of safety issues and security issues. But people were taking the oil, they were locally refining it, but then, dumping some of the residue into the delta. So, and I'm using that, and I'm sorry, I'm talking about Nigeria again and some of the dysfunction, but they were doing that because they felt and they lived in a way that they weren't sharing in the benefits from that oil and gas economy. But then in undermining that infrastructure, they're creating all sorts of security and safety issues that were ultimately counterproductive. And a company with Shell saying, can we stay here? And if we pull out, then we had the Chinese state-owned enterprise in sort of picking up the pieces. And that could be a bad outcome. What are your thoughts and maybe more how do we democratize energy and create those local benefits without undermining those centralized systems?
So maybe because as I said, I don't follow ONG very much, or especially as a sector. Maybe I'll pose the kind of the setup in terms of electricity. So every African utility has they report technical and non-technical losses, and non-technical losses is just euphemistically all the theft. Right? And so that's undermining it. But, people are stealing because they're poor and desperate, and they are intermediaries, unsavory characters that are preying on that vulnerability. So in Kenya, in the informal settings, we have a lot of gangs that control the stolen electricity, and it gets really unsavory pretty quickly. But at the kind of the core level, I think that when people are poor and people are desperate and they have no way to have dignified work, they do stuff like this, including, all of the kind of, trying to, harvest minerals or oil or these resources at an artisanal level it's really bad for your health. It's really backbreaking work. Children are involved. It's horrible. Nobody chooses to live like this. Everywhere in the world where we've seen this transition to kind of more dignified work, less exploitation, from the children who are working in the cotton mills in northern England to, I think all of those protections come when you have a society that is progressing, is becoming more affluent, is creating in parallel structures that provide social protections. And so this is really, really missing. And so I guess, and there are many, many, many things that need to happen to solve that. So I'm not going to try and minimize the complexity, but one thing that we often talk about is making people less poor solves a lot of problems for you. And there are studies about it. It makes them more healthy. It makes them more climate resilient. So actually, in poor countries, eradicating poverty is a climate solution. It's the number one climate solution. It makes them less desperate. And, even in Kenya is an example of a country where I'm from. It's an example of a country that has a little bit more of a middle and a working class. There's a little bit more of a segmentation there. People are still poor and live desperate lives. But this just you can see, the ways in which, people can make choices that kind of ensure a bit more of safety and dignity for their children as they kind of get less poor. So I think that we should really be thinking about how do we create opportunity? How do we create low wage? And this is what happened in, I think one of the things we freak out in the development space is, the model was always low skill jobs to get people off that kind of extreme subsistence life. And I know those pathways are kind of narrowing. So this is a big panic because that is how we kind of move society toward less dysfunction and more kind of dignified lives.
I think David and I fully agree that if you want to address some of these systemic issues, you have to lift people out of poverty first. And you've written and you've been critical about talking about carbon footprints now and the world effort to decrease emissions, that many national plans and international models, IPCC and others, that they've been crafted by foreign consultants. They don't have good local data. They don't have local context. And I don't know if they're taking into account the need for that economic development first and what we would imagine as a commensurate rise in emissions in order to then enable an energy transition that will ultimately decrease emissions in Africa. In short, and further to the substance of your TED Talk, unless I'm misrepresenting you, there needs to be room for emissions to grow at first, to get people out of poverty, to get the resources in, and then a burden placed on reducing emissions later on. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier about agency. I just, if you're not really actively thinking about your needs, your priorities, and kind of trying to shape the pathways around where you are, your context, where you're trying to get to, then you kind of have really kind of perverse outcomes, right? So, climate is really important. It's a big issue. We need to tackle it. Everybody, actually, to be honest, I sometimes feel like nobody agrees with that more than African people. I remember in the 2000s, we used to joke that the climate deniers only exist in the US and rich countries. People, nobody's climate denying in poor countries because people really feel the sense of precariousness and are, they're already suffering droughts and extreme weather, and they're hearing that there's this other phenomenon that will make that worse. So people were have always taken climate seriously. So when there was a blanket narrative, which is everybody in the world needs to mitigate, then what you have is countries, many countries in Africa with such kind of low per capita consumption and emissions. If you take out South Africa, I think the cumulative contribution of everyone else in sub-Saharan Africa is a fraction of 1% of the global picture. So there's nothing to mitigate because your consumption is so low. So, and B, that by mitigating nothing, you're obviously then also, you're not really solving the problem. So that's what I mean by when you have kind of more kind of agency and you have people thinking thoughtfully from their context about how their needs and their priorities, you start from there, from where you are, and then you try to intersect with the global picture, then you have less kind of perverse decisions where people are trying to, so you'd find rich countries say Scandinavian countries that are extremely Norway's an extremely pro-climate country. It's a huge ONG country, but they're fixated on trying to really push poor countries towards a particular energy trajectory, and I'm making a lot of noise on, at the bilateral and the multilateral kind of donor space in terms of what should be funded and not. But then it's not what Burkina Faso is doing with the energy system that matters. Actually, probably, it matters more what Norway is doing. And so that's kind of what I mean by agency. So, and I think sometimes people have taken this and I've tried to twist it to their own agenda. So I'm not saying that this is the way for Africa. I'm just saying start with kind of a thoughtful kind of understanding of the problem and the solutions, and don't just do this blanket application of some global narratives about what the problem or what the solution is.
Two comments. One, about something you mentioned you don't work on so much, which is the other big energy challenge in the developing world, which is access to clean fuels for cooking. A huge health toll, particularly on women, for indoor cooking with primitive fuels. And there's been lots of sort of action and political push to get cheap LPG, which can be distributed by, bicycles or mopeds that have the LPG canisters and would have an enormous health benefit for people. And not my knowledge in some places, I don't know how it's changed really recently, is that that's been blocked or attacked by rich world environmental groups that want to kind of block the development of fossil infrastructure. And I think that's really, well, a polite way to say it would be ethically questionable, given the giant benefits and the small actual total emissions involved. And I think I've seen that a little bit. I traveled looking at appropriate technology and stove development infrastructure in the early 90s in East Africa. And I think I really saw close up some of the need for access to clean fuels. And that's true lots of places around the developing world. And I think more broadly, my impression, partly from service on that Overshoot Commission, was that there's really a blindness in a bunch of elite climate policy circles in the rich world to the fact that any reasonable hope for development in the developing world would have a big buildup of emissions over the next decades. And that's not compatible with people's kind of imagination of these very rapid emissions cuts.
I think your comment is tying together like so many complex threads. But yes, all in all, like I really do believe that, poor people are suffering the most from a problem they did not create, and they deserve the most leeway to come out of poverty. And at the same time, they're also really, poor people, for example, they don't want to have old legacy polluting infrastructure either, So I think like in a lot of African countries, as a matter of policy, a lot of governments are very interested in expanding their renewable energy generation. They want to take advantage of their different renewable resources. They want to kind of get on board on the latest technology source, and they don't want to be like build a system that is outdated. So I think all of these points are operating at the same time, which is people want to be expedient in addressing poverty, but they're also in the same way they're trying to like think strategically about the future and how to build like future systems that are resilient and robust. So, but then at the end of the day, like my point is like less scrutiny for what, and like kind of dictating for what very poor people are doing to kind of achieve goals. And for the most part, if you're a very poor country, for the very, very poor, low-emitting countries, of which this represents just in Africa, this is just 1 billion people, fall in that bucket of very low-emitting. Even if they increase their energy consumption, even if they did that all with fossils, it'll make not a huge difference. That represents about 1 billion people. And so I think that fixate less on those people. That being said, I think there is a global reckoning right now, and we see this in the US, about like, what is the climate narrative? Like, what is, where do we go? People are not willing to pay, I think, an extra $10 a month in their bills for higher energy. We now have this new abundance narrative that is trying to like respond to this idea that people want more. They want cheap energy. They want, growth. And so I think that it's a different manifestation of this question, which is, how do we solve climate in ways that align with what people's aspirations? And energy innovation solves that to a large extent, but there are going to be trade-offs, and there's going to be a pain. And part of my point, which is a little bit maybe passing the buck, is I think that those trade-offs and those difficult discussions belong more in the rich, kind of richer, high-emitting countries than they do in the poor, low-emitting part of the world.
Yeah, and Rose, when you said that many or most sub-Saharan Africans recognize that climate change is real and it's happening. I was in Indonesia recently, and I experienced exactly the same thing. And yeah, and it's entirely anecdotal, but I didn't come across a climate denialism that is especially rampant in the United States. Your mid-latitude and equatorial states are really at risk and on the front lines of climate breakdown, and it's happening quickly. So how do you balance the changes that we need to make that are longer term? Like, what would you like rich countries, the global north, to do differently in international climate finance or aid or policy or bonds or carbon market rules that could really help to address this inequity and then set up Africa for success over the long term in reducing emissions. But then if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear from you some of the conversations that you had in Cape Town with David and a couple hundred others talking about climate engineering interventions like solar geoengineering and attitudes amongst those people from countries who are really on the front lines of climate breakdown.
So in terms of my wish list, it's such an interesting time to be asking this because, we're like in the US completely like dismantling aid. Everybody's paring back, so we've always had so every COP, like people show up and have their wish list, which is we never, give us more finance, loss and damages, So I don't know if it's productive for me to like restate that wish list that has always been.
And I will flag in your podcast, you did a show on like talking about dismantling aid.
They're the things that we would love, which is, you broke it, you fix it. There are all of these things that we would love to happen. Or also that, you will suffer more in the short term than you do and all of this. But then, sometimes at this point, it's clear that the global direction is that the receptiveness to this wish list messages are it's like lower than ever before, and in terms of like obviously the vulnerability and the kind of the risk that people are exposed to, we're still unpacking what that means. So there's still a lot of research that is trying to kind of figure out like what are the impacts and when and how. But definitely heat is a good one. So heat is where we know that the signal there is quite loud and clear that there's extreme heat and people are like already really experiencing that. My wish list is less for the like international people because I don't know what else we can say to them and they'll act according to the incentives, moral or not. So my message is more for like the leaders of poor countries who, have some blame in it. Like we were talking about Nigeria, there's a very corrupt political class that have brought the country to its knees. And it can't just all be the fault of the West. And so African leaders and leaders in poor countries need to get serious about, creating conditions in which like people in their countries can creating jobs and opportunity, which is how people have incomes, which is how they can buy fans and air conditioning. And you know what I mean? And we see this in places like India. And I know people will want to ask about how India's emissions are kind of increasingly part of the problem. I'm going to bookmark that too. But the idea is in India, like, and in China, like air condition ownership is really going up and like more and more people, there's still a lot of vulnerable people, but like as incomes increase, people are able to adapt and are able to bring on these appliances that make their lives better. And so especially for African countries, it starts with creating an economy and having an industrial policy that creates jobs, and then people have some income, and then they can start to kind of acquire these kind of life-saving appliances, whether it's kind of house cooling. And then you have to do things that there's some policy things you have to do, which is like require efficiency, high quality products, build the infrastructure in your grid. So I think there's the wish list for me is more for the African leaders at this point, because I don't know what rich countries will do. Maybe rich countries, what they can do is, invest in innovation that creates these high quality products that deliver the service at lower cost.
Mm-hmm. And what, I'm curious and to press you a bit, what message did you bring to that Solar Geo conference in Cape Town?
So I'm pretty new to this space. I'm kind of like an observer more than anything. I think it was very interesting to be in that conversation. And it was especially meaningful because actually there are quite a number, it's a small but growing number of African experts in that conversation who are doing research and modeling and scenario planning. And I think that is really great because it's that just to have credibility, on this topic, and you need like people from more parts of the world and just the global north, like weighing in at an expert in a substantive level. So I think when we were at the Degrees Forum in Cape Town, that was great, that there was quite a diversity of voices and opinions, and especially at the expert level. I'm still working through this, where I think it's extremely important that we have research and thinking at the frontiers. And David, we talked about this, that I want this research to be happening. I want people who are at the frontiers, like kind of the sentries at the edge of climate, who are exploring new options, who are like, trying to think about a broad solution set and kind of all of the different what ifs. And so I think that I'm excited about that. But in terms of how it feeds meaningfully into climate action right now, I think I left a little bit not sure, because I think that and this is especially for SRM, definitely right now, it complicates rather than simplifies the politics of climate action. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it can kind of meaningfully have bearing right now, because it just is it's so complicated for many reasons. But then I still think that it's important that we explore and understand and research that in a way that's as inclusive as possible. I know, David, what do you think about that? You were there too.
I agree that it complicates the politics, and that agreed. Whether that ends up being a good or bad thing, we have no idea. Yeah. Over to you, Ed, to close out.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions from our number one listener, our EVC superfan, Rob Tremblay. And his first question is, how reliable is the power that commercial and industrial loads get compared to households? And are they using diesel backup and rooftop solar? And is there dynamic and responsive load management as well when, say, solar production makes power cheaper? So that's one, if we can hold that. And then the second one, he's just asking about EV and EV penetration in Africa. Here it's quite a lot, especially two-wheel EVs. And how much is that affecting, or what kind of pressure is that putting on the development of grids?
Two good questions. So quick one on the first one. So I think most places, the utilities in many African countries try to have a segmentation by user price. So you have different tariffs for larger users. If you're a very, very big user, the utility might have a bespoke agreement with you, might have a kind of dedicated line to you if you're really important. So I think these ideas are active in African countries where because large power users, industrial users, are so important. I think in Kenya, out of 3,000 out of several million users are responsible for more than half of the revenues of the utility or something like that. So there's kind of an attempt to apply best practice in terms of how you manage your large users. But for the most part, many large users are experiencing, unreliable power, expensive power. Expensive power, everybody is. So it's just more expensive than in many African, in Kenya, it's just you're paying more than you would in other parts of the world. And then power quality is a big issue. So your equipment, so there a lot of industrial customers have to have a lot of contingencies to protect their equipment from when the voltage lags and that kind of thing. So I think that utilities are attentive to the problem, because if you start hemorrhaging your large power users, you're in trouble, and they're trying to have kind of more bespoke arrangements to make the experience better for large power users. But overall it's still a big problem, and a lot of users are doing captive energy, whether it's rooftop solar plus generators. Some of the big energy users, I think some years ago there was a big industrial user in Kenya who was going to have their own mini coal plant. I don't know where. I don't think that went anywhere, but people were just desperately trying to capture their own generation and bring down their costs. So it's still not a great situation. And if your industrial customers are suffering, that's a bad sign, because they are the ones who are supposed to have the kind of the sweetest deal to anchor the rest of the network. EVs, great question. I'm working, one of my big projects is on EV e-mobility in Africa. I think that there is a lot of energy, but this is, and in the 2-3-wheeler space, so there's a kind of an explosion of companies and business models and whatnot, but this is really, really small. So, tiny fraction. So in countries like, I don't know, I think South Africa, you're talking about, several thousand EVs, both across all classes. And this is one of our biggest markets. So I think there's a lot of hype that you will read in the news about everyone's going electric in Africa, and look at this one company has made a motorbike. So I would just take away for the listeners is there is energy and there's a real entrepreneurial spirit, but we are nowhere near scale for immobility. And some of that is, there's a lot of experimentation, basically, and that's exciting, but I think that it's just we're not quite there yet.
Yep. Well, that's one commonality between where we are here in Canada. We're still in EVs nowhere near at scale. Rose, do you want to take just 30 seconds? I alluded to it, to plug your new institute.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, yes, I'm just actually this week launching a new virtual think tank called the African Tech Futures Lab. We're actually incubated within the Energy for Growth Hub, where I am currently, where I served until recently as a research director. I'm now a science advisor, and I'm taking on this new role. African Tech Futures Lab is trying to leverage this network of African experts all over the world in the diaspora and on the continent, including myself, to try and weigh in on big questions around the science and technology that is reshaping the future. And so a lot of African countries are really in reactive mode, like things are happening to us. And there's not a lot of room to be strategic. And we, where other countries have a lot of kind of a brain trust of thinkers in a very diverse knowledge ecosystem, from academics to think tanks to lobbyists, you name it. There are a lot of people thinking about the future of X, whether it's in climate, the climate futures, energy futures, AI or digital tech futures. And so this virtual institute is trying to create a virtual platform where we can have diverse African thinkers kind of trying to think strategically about these kind of global transformations and trying to provide some strategic insight about, what this means if you're a poor African country. What do you do now? What do you do in the future? How does that change? So, look it up. Our website is live on Wednesday in a couple of days, www.africantechfutures.org, and I'd love to hear from you.
Cool. I hope listeners check it out. I look forward to checking it out myself. Rose, thank you. We covered a lot of ground today on a topic that we've wanted to cover for some time on EVC, but we haven't to date. So we're really grateful for you taking the time to come on and chat with us.
And thanks for having me. And I think there's so much more. We didn't even scratch the surface. Sorry, and I was jumping around. But I think please have more people on to talk about this, including I think the Nigeria question is interesting, and I think a lot of Nigerian experts would have a lot to say on that. But please don't shy away from this topic on EVC.
No, we won't. And so thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon, with help from Crystal Hickey, Vinuki Arachichi, and Harris Ahmed. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President Research and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back with more EVC content over the course of the summer, including a couple of climate book review shows with my old friend Roger Thompson. For now, enjoy the last couple of weeks of spring, and see you then.